I think it's safe to say that Yoko Taro is an absolute madman. When the cult classic Drakengard, or Dragon Dragoon as it's known in Japan, released in 2003 for the PlayStation 2, no one could really predict at the time that one of the endings of that game, where a dragon and a giant demonic entity are transported to a modern day Tokyo, would eventually spin off into a sub-series that would surpass its original series in terms of both popularity and commercial success. That sub-series is the NieR series, which began with a fairly successful NieR in the mid-2000s, which was developed by the now defunct Cavia and published by Square Enix for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Interestingly, in Japan, NieR released as two separate versions, NieR Gestalt, which was the version that was localized in Western regions, and NieR Replicant. The difference between the two versions is somewhat strange and completely different from anything I've ever seen in other games, in the sense that the age of the protagonist as well as the year the game is set in is different, whereas the events that happen in the game are exactly the same, with Gestalt having a more middle-aged, grizzled version of the protagonist and Replicant with a much younger teenage protagonist. As such, since the protagonists in each version are different ages, the dialogue they have as well as the relationships they have with other characters is slightly different, which narratively does change things up a little bit. Perhaps not enough to make playing both versions worthwhile, but at least to give you a different experience when playing. The reason for the difference in protagonists between versions is primarily due to the game releasing during the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation, when Japanese publishers attempted to westernize their games to cater to the potentially more lucrative Western market, usually resulting in failure or misunderstanding of what made those games popular in the first place. Whilst NieR Replicant was in development, the decision was made to change the protagonist's design for the Western audience, which tended to prefer older, more rugged protagonists than the more popular anime teen design that Japanese audiences preferred. Which brings us to the topic of this review, which is of the recently released NieR Replicant version 1.224744871139, which was developed by Toy Logic with some supervision from Platinum Games, the developers of NieR Automata, which was the second entry in the NieR series and the most commercially successful. This updated version of Replicant finally brings a Western localized version of the previously Japanese exclusive Replicant version of NieR with the teenage protagonist, so both new and old players will be able to enjoy the game in a new way. This updated version also updates a lot of the character models, textures, animations and lighting, as well as giving a complete overhaul of the game's combat, which was one of the minor complaints with the game's original release. Several new story additions were also added in this updated version, such as a couple new cutscenes during Routes C and D that flesh out Devil and Popola's backstories, and a new ending that closer ties the game to its sequel, NieR Automata. I'll admit, I never played the original NieR when it released, so my experience of familiarity with the series is fairly new, with the only entry I had played prior to this being the aforementioned NieR Automata, though I knew most of the narrative beats of Replicant due to attending the NieR Orchestra last year, as well as through casual late-night wiki reading. I've also been fascinated with this game, and getting to finally play it was an experience that I greatly enjoyed for the most part, though there are still flaws with the game that the remaster didn't iron out, which I'll go into in this review. As such, this review will be more of a full review of NieR as a whole rather than just a simple comparison between the original and its remake. I'll still make note of everything that's changed between versions of course, but everything that's mostly the same I'll discuss anyway. NieR Replicant version 1.224744871139, which for the rest of this review I'll refer to as just NieR Replicant because let's face it, the full title is a bit of a mouthful, released on PlayStation 4, Xbox One and Windows PC on April 22nd in Japan and the following day April 23rd everywhere else. For the purposes of this review, I played the game on PlayStation 4 through backwards compatibility on my PlayStation 5 to full completion, viewing all 5 endings, completing every side quest, and even going so far as to obtaining the Platinum Trophy for the game too, which, for those who don't know, is a pretty tedious and repetitive experience, so one I felt was worth it due to how much the game meant to me by the end of it. My total runtime with the game was around 80 hours give or take, which is a staggering amount, but casual players who just want to run through the story could easily view all the endings within 25 to 30 hours of playtime, with more experienced players being able to finish even sooner. So, Let's get on with the review and go over all the things NieR Replicant does well, does poorly, what changes and additions were made compared to the original release, and whether those changes and additions were worthwhile enhancements to an already compelling and fascinating game. The story of NieR is a very profound and complex one. The opening, set in the not too distant future, paints a bleak and depressing picture heralded by the end of humanity and the emergence of ghost-like creatures called shades. The interactions between the prologue versions of NieR and Yona immediately endears you to both characters, making the closure of that section a lot more tense and emotional, yet simultaneously confusing as hell when it immediately time skips several hundred years and you see the same characters at the same age and living a seemingly better life. The crux of the first half of the story revolves around a young child version of NieR exploring the world in an attempt to find a cure for the disease that his sister Yona has been inflicted with. The disease, known as the Black Scrawl, is a terminal illness with seemingly no cure, which makes the core goal of the plot a very personal and emotional one, as you see NieR's conflicted feelings as he witnesses the illness take its toll on his sister, as each quest leads him nowhere closer to his goal. This build-up in the first half helps you understand NieR's motivation throughout the game, as well as show how much he cares about Yona and their sibling bond, which makes the second half of the game, set several years after the first half, after Yona gets kidnapped by the mysterious Shadow Lord, all the more captivating. To see how the character has grown more and more desperate as he's struggling to save his sister, whilst at the same time alone in a world that is clearly dying, it's a very rough situation to be in, and you see that through the character's eyes and through his personality. This gets all the more complex when you factor in all the other characters that NieR encounters on his journey, who each have their own motivations and emotional backstories to help push the story along, from the beautiful yet crass Kaine, whom was treated like a monster and an outcast by the villagers from her hometown, or the lovable Emile, whose character arc throughout the runtime of Replicant offers some really emotional and heartbreaking scenes as the truth behind his tragic life is gradually revealed. One of the ways this story is so compelling is by the unlikely bond these characters forge over the course of the game, going from fairly apathetic and uncaring to loving and united in their goals. The relationships between the characters of NieR is one of the most enjoyable aspects of the narrative. The way each character keeps everyone on track, whether it's Kaine kicking the shit out of NieR to get him out of a bout of self-pity, to Emile and NieR affirming their love and care for Kaine when she experiences a rare case of vulnerability and self-doubt. These characters, who could be considered outcasts from modern society, become united and whole through the bonds they forge, and it's honestly one of the most beautiful aspects explored throughout this game as a result. That's not to say that the other characters are without development either, as a bunch of the townsfolk that you can interact with throughout the game, such as the lighthouse lady, the man with the red bag, and the king of facade, all become somewhat endearing characters by the end of their story arcs, and it helps to make the settlements in NieR feel all the more special and alive despite the apocalyptic nature of the world. This development only gets stronger in the second half of the game, where the threat from the Shades, the main antagonistic force in the game, becomes all the greater and the settlements start feeling the threat of this menace a lot more. This change in tone from the first half to the second is one of the main ways the story as a whole is so memorable. The first half of the game plays and feels just like any standard JRPG adventure. You're exploring a wondrous world, meeting new friends and experiencing the thrill of adventure as you seek to save the maiden. However, when the second act of the story begins and it time skips several years, the vibe the game gives off completely changes. The veil has been torn off and the world no longer feels wondrous, instead bleak and desolate. Every friend you made in the first half experiences some form of life-changing trauma, and the thrill of adventure has changed to despair and hopelessness. This change in tone is one of the most effective and impactful examples I've ever experienced in a form of media, and as a result it helps to really define NieR and help prove that it's one of the greatest stories to be told through the video game medium. Because you have that somewhat positive and wondrous experience with the world and characters in the first half, having it all gradually crash down around you as you progress through the game really leaves its mark on the player, and by the end of it, you'll come to really respect the mad, chaotic nature of Yoko Taro's creative genius. One of the big features of NieR is that the first full playthrough isn't the end of the game, as when you finish the game for the first time and achieve the first ending, titled Ending A, you'll be given the chance to replay the game from the start of the second half, with completion rewarding you with ending B and then replaying again offering you ending C and D, with each playthrough rewarding the player with some new story content that helps to flesh out the world and characters further. In the second playthrough, for instance, extra visual novel-esque cutscenes are added which reveals Kaine and Emil's backstories, which flesh those characters out even further and helps to get the player a lot more emotionally attached to them. Other additions exclusive to later playthroughs include subtitles for all of the Shade bosses so that you can understand what they are saying, which adds an extra level of complexity to the game's already morally complex narrative. The remake adds quite a bit of new content to the story as well, such as the inclusion of previously cut content from the original NieR in the form of the Little Mermaid section, which involves a large shipwreck that washes up on the shore of Seafront's beach during the second half of the game. This section of the game is really entertaining and is one of the more interesting and well written sections of the game, though is structured in a way that makes it a bit tedious on repeated playthroughs. Another huge addition to the story in the remake is the addition of a new ending, Ending E, which is made available after obtaining Ending D and starting a completely new playthrough. When you reach the point in the game where you fight the boss in the Eyrie, the story suddenly diverges and continues from where Ending D left off, in a way that better ties the game's narrative into that of its sequel, Automata. From my understanding, this new ending isn't really new, as it was adapted from one of the many light novel tie-ins with the game, though to actually see and play through this ending, complete with new music, makes it a much more impactful way to experience it than just reading the book. So far you can probably tell that I really love this game's story and that it was one that deeply affected me on a personal level, but that doesn't mean that it is without its problems, and sadly, some of NieR Replicant's problems are huge enough that they can't be ignored, and they haven't really been solved in the remake either. First and foremost, the side quests in the game are mostly utter skippable garbage, with most of them just being pointless fetch quests that don't really offer any meaningful dialogue or rewards. For example, one quest involves just fetching rare materials for a guy to fix his kitchen, and it doesn't really flesh out the world or story of the game in any way, and the reward is just a paltry amount of cash, which isn't really something you'll be short of in this game, especially by the time you finish that quest. Admittedly, some quest lines are interesting, such as the quest chain involving the Lighthouse Woman and the quests involving Devil and Poplar, which reward the player with some neat character development and short yet sweet storylines. The missable side quest in the second half, featuring the man with the red bag in particular, was one of my favourites because it was short and sweet but showed a side to the character of NieR that isn't really shown much in the game and makes some of the events later in the game all the more impactful, emotional and tragic. That being said, none of the side quests are really required to finish the game, aside from the few that reward you with weapons, as obtaining all weapons is a requirement for ending C and D and by proxy ending E. So for the most part this flaw isn't that egregious in the grand scheme of things. The same cannot be said for this game's greatest flaw, which is the absurd amounts of padding and repetition the game forces you to go through in order to finish the game completely, as you can't really just stop at ending A and get the full game experience, as each ending is meant to follow one another narratively. The problem with this is that for each ending you have to replay the entire second half of the game, or in the case of ending E, the first half of the game, which is incredibly tedious considering there aren't really enough changes between playthroughs to justify the amount of repetition. For example, your playthroughs for ending C and D will be exactly the same and only feature a couple extra cutscenes and combat sections compared to ending B. It's not like in NieR Automata where each playthrough is different enough that playing through them is still interesting and rewarding, but in Replicant this just isn't the case. If they had changed the player character in each playthrough or just streamlined the repetitive content like NieR Automata did, it would have been much more bearable, but damn, the tedium really does drag down what would otherwise be a near-perfect game. Near-perfect. That being said, despite the tedium, I think playing through the story is still very much worth it, as it's one that is told extremely well, with excellent character development, an incredibly beautiful albeit tragic world with engrossing and fascinating lore, and most importantly of all, it tells a story that feels original, emotional and important. And if there's one thing I have to recommend from this game, it is definitely seeing the game through to the end, as even though the road to the end requires you to repeat so much and it does get grating by the end of it, it's a journey worth taking, and the destination is one that will change you and the way you see video game storylines as a result. One of the major complaints when it came to the original NieR was how slow and cumbersome the combat systems in the game were. They were decent and work well enough, of course, but as mentioned earlier, there is a lot of tedious repetition to the game's storyline that requires you to repeat large chunks of the story to reach new content, and the combat system, with how slow and somewhat unintuitive it was, only made that problem all the worse. The combat wasn't bad, mind, and it would have been perfectly serviceable if the game was shorter and the constant tedium and repetition wasn't a factor. Thankfully, it was announced early on in development of the remake that the developers Toy Logic were receiving advice from Platinum Games, the developers of the sequel NieR Automata, with regards to bringing the standard of quality for the game's combat up to the standards that Automata was praised for. As a result, the combat in NieR Replicant's remake feels a lot more fluid and satisfying, similar to that of Automata, and in some ways is even superior to that game's combat, with a surprising amount of depth and level of complexity that keeps combat for the most part interesting and engaging throughout the entirety of the game's playtime. You have 3 distinct types of weapons at your disposal for melee attacks: short swords, big bulky swords, and spears, which each feel different to use both in terms of the combos you can use, but also in terms of the weight of the weapons and the speed in which you can attack with them. As such, you'll often find yourself switching weapons on the fly to deal with large and small groups of enemies depending on the situation. You can collect more weapons of each type for exploration and through completing side quests in the world, or from buying them from vendors, and whilst most of the weapons are fairly useless as you'll just want to use the weapons that have the best stats, they all have unique and interesting designs and models that at the very least make the weapons visually different. Upgrading the weapons, however, is single-handedly the absolute bloody worst thing to do in this game, and it's a lesson in patience and stupidity for anyone who dares try to get the trophies and achievements associated with maxing them all out. Weapon upgrading is introduced fairly early on in the game when you first arrive at the Junk Heap location, where a duo of brothers will upgrade your weapons in exchange for resources. Fairly standard stuff, I know, but the problem with this, and the reason it is the most tedious aspect in the game, is that 90% of the materials required to upgrade the weapons are really rare materials that only drop from specific enemies, and even then the drop rates are lower than 1% in most cases. This wouldn't be a huge problem if there were decent areas for farming enemies, but a lot of the more specific types of shade only spawn in specific areas and at certain points in the story, and the amount of enemies that spawn at a time are so minuscule that you'll almost definitely spend hours and hours just trying to get a single material. Of course, me being the mad bastard I am, I of course did it. I upgraded all the weapons I needed for the trophies that required it, and then immediately rushed to finish the game because god damn, story aside, this game is so gosh darn padded with tedious nonsense that it actively distracts from the game's quality. Sure, the weapon upgrading is optional for the most part, and you can definitely clear the game without needing to worry about it at all, but at that point then, what's the point in even implementing it in the first place as a feature? Your weapons aren't your only method of attack either, as early on you'll meet the enigmatic Grimoire Weiss, which will allow you to use dark magics to damage enemies from a distance. Unlike the weapons, you can't upgrade the spells you obtain over the course of the game, with all the spells being unlocked by the time you reach the halfway point of the first playthrough, which does mean that they kind of lose their luster after a while due to how the spells don't evolve or change, but at the same time they're an addition to combat rather than the central focus, so it's not that big of a deal, and they are fun to use in conjunction with the weapons, so it balances itself out, I think. Killing shades will sometimes reward you with items called words, which can be assigned to an attack type or weapon in order to give it some better stats, with each weapon or action being able to apply 3 words at a time. It honestly doesn't change combat up that much, and I only really used it a handful of times over the course of the game, due to the low challenge the game offers in general, but I'd imagine it'd be a great system to use if playing through the game on the harder difficulties, or for specific scenarios such as using the words that grant a better drop rate when farming materials and so on. The boss fights in the game are pretty interesting initially, with a lot of them requiring quite a bit of skill to beat, where you'll need to master dodging waves of enemy attacks and optimizing damage to defeat them. Admittedly, in repeat playthroughs, the challenge doesn't change, so when you face the bosses again, which is required to get all the endings, they start to melt under your increased strength and higher level, though because a lot of the bosses have scripted mid-fight cutscenes, you can only damage them up to the cutscene trigger threshold, which can be a bit annoying on repeated playthroughs because sitting through the same unskippable dialogue that you've seen multiple times already because you just want to get to the new content can get a little grating, especially when it can sometimes take quite a while to transition to the next phase of the fight. That being said, most of the bosses are enjoyable for what they are, and there are a ton of different ones all throughout the game, with some really cool new ones added in the remake that prove to be some of the more enjoyable gameplay content in the game. The boss of the Little Mermaid section of the remake even changes quite dramatically on repeated playthroughs, though as I'll mention in a bit, the rest of that section is one of the more tedious examples of gameplay the game demonstrates to compensate for that. Of course, the ultimate issue with NieR Replicant both in its original and remake versions is the tedious nature of the game's narrative, requiring multiple playthroughs in order to get the full story and understand what is actually happening. And whilst the narrative itself is incredible and more than worth the repetition, due to being able to skip cutscenes you've already seen, which mitigates the tedium somewhat, the gameplay is really where this flaw is most apparent, as a lot of the dungeons, especially in the end half of the game, which is repeated the most, has some light puzzle solving, usually involving tedious box pushing, which is simple enough to be easy to complete, yet time consuming, and you'll have to solve these puzzles in each playthrough, which can get very repetitive. Likewise, some of the gameplay sections, such as the aforementioned Little Mermaid section, are very narrative heavy, but with the kind of cutscenes and exploration that can't be skipped, which is just like with the puzzle solving, pretty cool in the first playthrough, a little less interesting in the second, and then mind-numbing and repetitive with each playthrough after, and as such it can really drain one's enjoyment as a result. But don't get me wrong, the core structure of the gameplay is really enjoyable with satisfying combat and some really cool and enjoyable boss fights. However, at the same time, with a lot of the other aspects of this game, I feel like the tedious repetition is what's ultimately holding the game back from being one of the greatest games ever made. Now, one of the most notable changes with this new version of NieR Replicant compared to the original release is the large amount of graphical updates both in terms of overall fidelity and general artistic design, to bring the game up to modern standards, but to also better tie the game in visually to its sequel NieR Automata. The original NieR was a fairly average looking game at the time of its release, with fairly muddy textures and fairly rough character models, though one could make an argument that those imperfections resonate with the overall tone of the narrative quite well. This new version, however, revamps pretty much most of the visuals, from character models to lighting and textures. Everything feels a lot more consistent in its quality when it comes to the game's visuals because of that. That being said, not everything is improved in this new version, as most of the locations have received little to no changes aside from any new assets created for the game, such as the content in the Little Mermaid and Ending E sections of the game. Thankfully though, the locations in NieR to begin with were one of the more visually appealing aspects of the game, from the dusty mechanical depths of the Junk Heap to the desert city of Facade. All of the locations in NieR are memorable and full of charm. My personal favourite location is the port town of Seafront, as the white buildings and the general vibe reminded me very heavily of some of the Greek ports I used to visit when I lived in Greece. As for the character models, whilst they were fairly rough in the original NieR, both in the Japanese Replicant release as well as the Western Gestalt release, the new version of Replicant drastically updates the character models, both in regards to the general designs of the characters as well as the polygon count and texture work. The characters now look more in line stylistically with those found in NieR Automata, which makes sense considering the main character designer of the new version of Replicant, Akihiko Yoshida, also was the main character designer of Automata. That being said, whilst the characters do look a lot better overall in terms of the fidelity of the models, I personally think the shading of the characters loses something that helped the general vibe of the game compared to in the original NieR, where the dark, almost grungy shading and lighting helped to capture the bleak and often depressing and dystopian nature of the world the characters were living in, a bit more than it does in the remake. This though is a minor gripe I have with the remake's visual design, which is counterbalanced by nearly every other change being for the better, as the lighting overall is a lot better and the texture and model work for the most part is significantly better than before, and the updated art style, whilst initially startling for those that are accustomed to the original version style, is ultimately, in my opinion, more consistent across the entire game, and that consistently helps greater to better draw you into the world and the story as a result. The enemy designs in NieR are fairly unchanged between original and remake, but they are very simplistic, and whilst the bosses in the game all have really cool unique designs, the regular enemies are a little bland and repetitious. There are tons of different enemy designs, mind, but a lot of them share similar proportions and the same general colour scheme and pattern, so despite the variety of enemy types, they all feel fairly similar in their design, which in this case doesn't help the game's teething problems at all. One thing that I noticed is that the game, at least on PlayStation 4, has no PlayStation Pro enhancements, which means that the game for the most part runs the same in terms of performance and resolution on PS5 as it does on both PS4 and PS4 Pro. This means that the game runs at a 1080p resolution with minimal anti-aliasing, meaning that if you play the game on a large 4K TV or monitor, the game's artistic design is fairly compromised and everything will look a lot less visually pleasing to the eye, to the point where I'd say that it looks similarly to how a 480p game would look on a 1080p TV, which is a real shame considering the game is gorgeous normally. As for performance, the game runs really well for the most part, and I don't recall ever experiencing any bugs or glitches or major frame drops or freezing at all throughout my time with the game. Load times too, at least on PlayStation 5, weren't too much of a hassle, which, considering how tedious the game can get in the later half of the playthrough, and considering how many load screens there are, it's a major boon that makes the remake a lot more appealing overall than the original release. The music of NieR Replicant is undoubtedly one of the greatest video game soundtracks out there, both in regards to the original release as well as with this remake. It cannot be understated just how important Keiichi Okabe's score is to bringing life to the world of NieR and making the story as impactful and as emotional as it is. The power that this soundtrack has is unbelievable, whether it's the haunting and ominous choir of Snow in Summer that heralds the beginning of the story and frames the prologue in such a tragic light, or the emotionally devastating Emil's sacrifice, which manages to appropriately convey the tragic and heartbreaking nature of Emil's character in perfect clarity. This soundtrack does all that and more perfectly. The soundtrack manages to do an incredible job of playing the right songs at the right times to heighten the emotional weight of certain scenes within the game's narrative, and it's why NieR as a series is somewhat defined by its music. The character themes are, in my opinion, one of the standouts, such as the track Kaine's Salvation, which emphatically conveys the beauty and turmoil that surmise the character of Kaine, as well as the troubles she experiences over the course of the game. The aforementioned Emil's sacrifice likewise accurately portrays the tragic nature of the character Emil, though the other version of his theme, Emil Karma, also does so whilst also offering a faster pace more suitable for use during more intense and kinetic scenes such as boss fights. Song of the Ancients, which is a song that Deviler and Populus sing at different times over the course of the game, is one of my absolute favourites, and a part of that reason is the fact that each variation of the song is so different, yet still manages to express the core power of the song. The Deviler and Poplar versions each sound sublime on their own, but when combined, especially for the Fate version of the song near the end of the game, it creates a very powerful tune that shows the conflicted thoughts that the twins have as they fight to achieve their purpose over the course of the game. The remake version of the soundtrack is just as strong, with the entire track list recomposed with slight differences that I personally prefer over the original version's OST. That being said, the fact that you cannot switch between the two soundtracks is a little disheartening, as I'm sure there are people out there who prefer the original compositions of the tracks. The remake does feature a couple new tracks as well, mainly centred around the new content included, such as the Little Mermaid chapter of the game, as well as the new ending E. All of these tracks are superb, with the track Fleeting Words that plays during the boss fight during the Little Mermaid section being one of, if not my absolute favourite track in the game. with the way the track builds up with an epic choir giving weight to a track that really exemplifies the epic nature of the boss fight in which it plays, while simultaneously portraying the bitter rage and sadness that Louise is feeling throughout the fight. Suffice to say, I'm a huge fan of the soundtrack to NieR Replicant, both in its original and its remade compositions, so much so that I can say it's the element of the game with the least amount of flaws. Whilst one's enjoyment of the story and gameplay is somewhat hampered by the obnoxious amount of repetition and tedium, the music always stays enjoyable and helps to alleviate some of that tedium despite how many times the tracks are repeated. Aside from the soundtrack, the game excels in other areas when it comes to its sound, with the full voice acting both in regards to the Japanese and English dubs being absolutely superb and features some of the best voice acting and characterization I've ever seen in a video game. Interestingly, all of the voice lines in the remake were re-recorded by the original voice actors from the original game's dub. There were new voice actors for the new content, as well as English dub voice actors for boy and adult NieR, since previously the Replicant version of NieR was Japanese exclusive.
Had my revenge, and now it's over.
Oh, now, see here, this is rich.
Vice?
We helped you in some mad quest for vengeance, and now you think to bid us adieu? How can a fighter so skilled be cursed with such a thick head? A true warrior would fight. They would give all in the service of their friends.
Friends? That's right. He's right. Kaine, we're friends now.
See here, that was hardly the point.
Okay, then what is the point?
The new dub recording is, from what I've seen and heard over the course of the game, absolutely superb and somehow manages to be even better than the original game's dub, which in itself was already incredible for the time. The English language option, which is the one I used when playing through the remake in particular, is so incredibly good and is a major reason why the characters and the events in NieR hit so hard for me. Laura Bailey's Kaine and Liam O'Brien's Grimoire Weiss in particular are absolutely phenomenal and standout characters because of it. Laura Bailey manages to convey the vulgar and crass Kaine perfectly, whilst also managing to make the more fragile elements of the character's personality shine during the brief glimpses of them you get throughout the story. Meanwhile, Liam O'Brien manages to portray Grimoire Weiss as a sophisticated and intelligent, albeit pompous and self-absorbed book that he is. Yet over the course of the game manages to convey how the character's personality changes as he's surrounded by friends that care for him, with some excellent line delivery in the latter half of the game that honestly never fails to get me emotional. Which is honestly something that extends to a large portion of the cast as well, such as Eden Regal's work as Devla and Poplar, Zach Aguilar and Ray Chase's work as young NieR and adult NieR respectively. They all put the work in to define their characters and bring them to life in a way that feels great, yet also in a way that makes you care about them. Words on their own do a good job of describing a character and their personality, but it's often the voice actors that truly bring those words to life, and it's never been more true about an emotional, raw and tragic story such as NieR, where the core heart and soul of the game is shown for its characters and their interactions and tragic fates. Even the side characters do a brilliant job of what they're given and make you really care about them and want them to do well, which for me at least is shown perfectly through the Red Bagman character voiced by the late great Brad Venables. The Red Bagman is a new character in the remake whom is introduced alongside his wife during the first half of the game when you are playing as young NieR, but then he becomes a bit more important as a fast travel NPC when you get to the second half of the game. For the most part, he's a fairly unimportant character in the grand scheme of things, but his playful and somewhat comedic personality, as well as his love for his wife and friendship with NieR, whom he shares several heartwarming scenes with, helps to endear him to the player more so than many other games I've seen done with side characters. The Japanese dub is also pretty superb from what I've heard, though admittedly I'm not too familiar with it aside from listening to some of it in preparation for this video. One small nitpick I do have with the voice acting, or lack thereof in this case, is that despite all of the dialogue being voiced, the novel sections of the game, such as the flashbacks detailing Kaine and Emil's backstories, aren't voiced at all, which isn't the worst thing in the world as it's easy to just read it, but the excellent voice acting would have made these emotional short stories a lot more powerful and engaging to experience than just reading white text on a black background. Overall, when it comes to it all, there is a clear reason why NieR Replicant is such a memorable game with a very dedicated cult following, and the remake improves on almost every aspect of it. The story is incredibly well written, with some of the best characters and character development that I've ever experienced in a video game. Admittedly, the story does get a little tedious on repeated playthroughs due to the story requiring multiple playthroughs to get the full story, but the unique story content is all really solid, and the new content is intertwined seamlessly into the existing narrative perfectly, and adds more depth to the world and the themes of NieR. The world itself is gorgeous, with many different biomes with unique and interesting NPCs to interact with, though the way in which you get around the world can be quite tedious, especially when attempting to venture to any of the game's few dungeons. The side quests too are quite tedious, with only a handful of them being worthwhile or of any real substance, and the weapon upgrades require godlike levels of patience due to terrible drop rates for almost every weapon material involved. Graphics are something this game has for sure, with the original NieR being somewhat beautiful yet hindered by the hardware and rough in quite a lot of places, whereas the remake completely replaces most of the assets and brings it more in line with the art style and fidelity of those found in NieR Automata, which in turn makes it more consistent and beautiful as a result. One of the elements that truly shines brightest in both the original and the remake of NieR is its sound, both in regards to its incredible soundtrack as well as its voice acting. The original soundtrack is phenomenal and filled with several gorgeous and emotionally captivating tracks that will have you quietly sobbing as they bring out the best of every scene in which they play, whilst the English and Japanese voice dubs bring the brilliantly written characters to life in a way that cannot be described as anything other than perfection. The gameplay in the original NieR is serviceable, albeit very flawed, and makes an already tedious game almost insufferable, which explains why, despite its cult following, not many people actually finish the game. However, the remake improves on this in every way by taking inspiration from Automata to create something that isn't particularly complex or difficult, but is immensely satisfying, responsive and fun, that makes the sometimes aggravating levels of tedium a lot more bearable, though not completely. All in all, NieR Replicant is one game that truly needs to be experienced, and it had a profound impact on me as I went through it. Not everything was perfect, and there were a lot of flaws beneath the surface of the game that annoyed me a little, in particular the obnoxious amount of repetitious padding that is required to see with the game's endings, but so much of the game, in particular the story and music, makes this one game that I can't help but recommend for anyone looking for a meaningful and thought-provoking story-driven game to play through. Admittedly, I'm not sure the remake is going to be my personal game of the year despite its high level of quality and the amount of impact it had on me, as there are plenty of games releasing later in this year that I believe could outshine the enhancements made, and I think It Takes Two, which I reviewed earlier this year, is a much more overall solid and worthy game for such an accolade, despite it not being as emotionally impactful. I enjoyed It Takes Two, for instance, a lot more than I did NieR, but I got a lot more meaning and emotional depth from NieR, which to me makes the latter the more memorable and impactful of the two, but at the same time, unlike It Takes Two, I'll always wish NieR was better due to its flaws dragging it down. I do hope though that we get at least one or two more core games in the NieR series at some point in the future, perhaps one that links the story more closely with its side series Drakengard, or maybe one that shows a glimpse into some of the events that occur in the large span of time between NieR and NieR Automata. Though I'm sure whatever comes next from series director Yoko Taro and his team, it'll be chaotic, immemorable, and emotionally devastating. But that's all the time we have in this video. If you enjoyed this look into NieR Replicant, then hit the like button and comment below with your thoughts. It really helps the channel out. Likewise, subscribe to keep up to date with future videos so you don't miss out. Thanks again for watching. This has been Kingdom H, and I'll see you next time.